Hello, everyone. Welcome to the COGEX live session on food and nature. I'm Lucy Armand. I'm the head of the Nature for Climate Coalition, initiative of 18 organisations, including environmental NGOs, corporate coalitions, and UN agencies. We're very excited to be here at COGEX today, particularly to be here in person. Some of us are here virtually. And we're also excited to reach a new tech audience today on the important topic of nature and climate and food systems. Our mission at Nature for Climate is simple. It's to promote the role of nature-based solutions and to increase investment in and action on these proven natural ecosystem protection and restoration strategies. The facts are fairly straightforward. We cannot reach the goals of the Paris Agreement without nature. And in the next critical decade, nature-based solutions deliver a third of the climate solution, but currently only receive 10% of the funding. So while the mission sounds simple, there's nothing straightforward about nature-based solutions, and we're going to hear a lot more about that today. There are extremely complex issues around nature-based solutions and food system transformation. And today we're here to talk about one component in that complex picture, how science and technology can play a role in accelerating the deployment of nature-based solutions, what we've dubbed nature tech. So to us, nature tech is technologies that can enable, accelerate, and ensure the integrity of nature-based solutions, which can include satellite monitoring, AI, drone technology, digital DNA technologies, and a whole range of ag tech solutions, which we're going to hear about in the next session. So we're delighted to host sessions on the planet stage today at COGEX, and now we're going to hand over to Mark Kahn, co-founder and CEO of Omnivore, impact investors in the ag sector, a serial social entrepreneur and CEO of AgriLab, Aboah, who's tackling food security issues in Ghana, and moderated by the editor of AgFunder News, Louisa Burwood-Taylor. Over to you, Louisa.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy. Great to be here. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak here and on a topic that I care deeply about. So I'm the head of media and research for AgFunder. We're a venture capital firm, but one that's helped to build the community around ag tech with a media and research platform. So AFN, which Lucy referred to, is our news platform, and we report all on ag tech and food tech. And then we also do investment research reports, which I handle as well. Investment in this sector of food tech and ag tech has grown extensively in the last few years. So last year it reached about $30 billion, which was 8 times what it was 8 years ago in 2012. And a large amount of that investment is in technologies that aim to have a positive impact for the world, whether that's socially or more particularly environmentally. And we actually often say that we think it's hard to find an ag tech investment that doesn't have a positive impact, particularly farm tech. Most farm technologies are designed to do more with less, grow more with fewer natural resources, reduce the burden of our food and agriculture industry on the planet. As Lucy mentioned, it is very, very complex, and in many ways we're at the start of the journey. Even though some of us has been working on this for many years. So one of our speakers, Mark Kahn, is one great example. He co-founded Omnivore, which is an Indian ag tech and food tech VC 10 years ago, or in 2010, with his co-founder, Janesh Shah. But he's also worked in various different agricultural roles before in India and elsewhere. So he is definitely one of the most knowledgeable people in the space and someone I will often call on. And then we've also got Aboah, who is our second speaker. He's also no stranger to impact and social entrepreneurship. He's the founder of AgriLab, a greenhouse farm and youth-led organization that sits at the nexus of combating urban food security in Ghana. And he's done various initiatives before that as well. So to kick things off, I mean, this is a big question, right? How can technology, work in conjunction with nature and improve, how our food systems are impacting our planet? Mark, can you just start by giving us an example of a few technologies that are out there that you would class as nature tech?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, it's an interesting designation because, as you kind of said, everything that's happening in agri-tech has a huge, has a huge focus on sustainability. So at Omnivore, when we think about nature tech, we're really thinking about, systems that are reducing the burden on the external environment to allow agriculture and nature to coexist, in a more sustainable and less disruptive fashion. So, one example that I would think about would be various forms of controlled environment agriculture. Not just, to be clear, the urban farming or vertical agriculture that you see in the West, but also the use of polyhouses, right, tunnels, and more emerging markets kind of friendly controlled environment agriculture that we see in environments like in India. One of our portfolio companies, Clover, is running really the largest controlled environment agriculture platform in India. And really what it's saying is, let's try to, enclose farming to some extent with shielding it from the environment, but also, right, in that sense, allowing it to be less impactful on nature itself. So this reduces abiotic threats, it reduces biotic threats, it puts, kind of a bubble around the whole thing, a polyhouse bubble around the whole thing. And in the process, allows the overall environmental footprint of farming to go down a great deal. And obviously there are more capex intensive versions of this, like aero farms, right, or App Harvest, or some of these giant LED centric kinds of controlled environment platforms. But we're really seeing this in markets in the developing world as well.
It's interesting that you bring up sort of indoor agriculture as a nature technology, and I absolutely see your point. What about some of the technologies that are working in conjunction with nature? Maybe some of the inputs on the biological side. Can you speak a bit to those? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think increasingly there is a recognition that the sort of green revolution formulas of intensive chemical fertilizer and really aggressive crop protection need to be balanced with a recognition of their externalities. And so we've seen over the last few years, not as much in India yet, though it will come up, increasingly intelligent usage of biologicals. So there have been a number of startups globally that are focused on soil bacteria, for example, or microbial products, essentially finding ways to not necessarily always replace chemical crop protection or chemical fertilizers in full, but to create a balance that allows for the environmental footprint of those to be reduced, that allows for the aggregate usage of chemicals to be reduced without compromising on yield or quality or biotic risk protection. And so that's a space that globally has become really, really hot in the last few years. That's the space where Indigo started, and there are so many other companies that are working in that ecosystem right now, and it's one where we expect to see a lot of traction in the next few years.
Great, Isaac. What role do you think technology can play in creating more equitable food systems that work in partnership with nature?
Yeah, so I think here in Africa, the problem at the foundation is that you can see that where the food systems exist, basically where crop production starts, is probably relegated from where consumption really happens. So we're talking about, in cases, 8 to 10 hours of transportation to actual marketplaces where foods are going to be sold. So the problem that creates definitely is that because of increasingly difficult transportation systems that exist, the food might get to a particular place and it's spoiled, amongst other things. So I think there are different ways that we're going to think about this problem, but it first starts from looking at the big infrastructural problem. But then at the source of production, we can think about ways that we can merge, especially for smaller communities, we can merge just common technologies, actually, like irrigation systems, like precision agricultural tools that will allow them to enable higher yield and also preservation of the food. So we're talking about things like cold chains. Those are very not so revolutionary technologies if you think about it, I guess, in the global sense, especially if you think about it in the Western sense. But these are going to increasingly help to make sure that there is increased yields and also there's protection of the food for some time before they eventually get to where they're supposed to get to. But I do not think it's always so much a talk about actually the technologies, because these technologies sometimes exist, but it's more about the business models that exist to allow for smaller communities to use them, right? So there's the conversation around how with the upcoming technologies that exist, we're going to have big farming companies come to like cloud the whole farming industry and then take the influence of small communities and smallholder farmers. And this exists because the young farmers, the smallholder farmers, are not able to actually purchase these technologies, which are quite expensive, right? So we need to look at ways that we can like come up with innovative business models, maybe pay-as-you-go business models where maybe farming cooperatives are coming together to share, say, a certain kind of technology and then allow them to pay in small bits. That way we can bring farming communities together into the conversation when we're talking about technologies so that we don't relegate them, so that they can benefit and also just exist in the conversation of food systems.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just before I make a follow-up, I want to tell everyone in the audience, please do submit any questions you have. I can take those during our conversation or save a bit of time at the end to answer some of those. So just on that point, Isaac, can you tell us a bit more about AgriLab, and how it came about? Because it's really based around kind of community-led initiatives, isn't it?
Yeah, so I started AgriLab when I was in my fourth year in university, and it was just basically from student competition. Went to a couple of student competitions, and what we're trying to do is like set up a greenhouse farm, and eventually did this in conjunction with our school, and then afterwards we continued. But the bigger idea is also to reach out to communities and show them new ways that they can use things like conservation farming to make sure that they are increasing their yield. Because this, there was this conversation around regenerative farming. It's not caught up here in Africa yet. But there are ways that we can actually conserve our soil. There are centers here in Ghana that are actually expecting that. There are ways that we can conserve our soil because, as you guys know, there is huge amount of loss of water because of the climate conditions, amongst other things. And the farmers who are basically kind of focusing or dependent on rain-fed water find it difficult to balance the changing climate and the rains not coming, amongst other things. So looking at ways that we can just introduce things like cover cropping, mulching the land, and making sure that there is a way to conserve the land, there is a way to reduce the amount of labor, there's a way to make sure that more productivity can be gotten than using too much labor input, too much chemicals, things that like we are focused on.
Great. Mark, talking about this community question, we've often talked about how you have these, fantastic technologies being developed all over the world. The US is definitely a leader when it comes to ag tech on the digital front, on the biotech front, sure. Many different areas, but often, exporting those technologies or making sure they're relevant for emerging markets like India and parts of Africa can be a bit of a challenge. And as Isaac mentioned, often farmers can't afford these technologies. What are some of the business models you've seen that, are relevant and can actually work in India and that could be transported elsewhere?
Look, I think in general, when digital technologies are being developed in the US or Israel or Europe, they're oftentimes not very applicable for smallholder farmers. They're not priced for smallholder farmers. They sort of fail to consider the affordability factor. They also aren't really geared up for a farm of 1, 2, or 3 hectares in terms of even the way the entire go-to-market approach is set up. We see a lot more applicability of kind of Indian technologies that are built with smallholder farmers in mind from the very get-go, going into markets in sub-Saharan Africa, smallholder parts of Latin America and Southeast Asia. And we've seen that with our portfolio. We've seen that with, in terms of Eruvaca selling its aquaculture IoT technologies throughout Latin America. We see that in Fussell, which is, Isaac talked about kind of on-farm sensors, right? Fussell is an entirely indigenously manufactured sensor array for smallholder farms that we make in India, but we're beginning to sell, around the world. I think it's very hard to engineer these products initially in the West and bring them into emerging markets. It's much easier to kind of build these South-South connects and see that, these technologies flowing from a market like India, which has a low-cost manufacturing base, into other smallholder-centric markets.
Yeah, because I think that there's a relatability in the kind of problem that exists, for example, in India and in Africa, right? So, or in America, perhaps these are large farms. We have some of those in Africa, but then there's a preponderance of smallholder farmers in India as you'd have in Africa. And so just the understanding of the problem in the first place gives you an idea to how to tackle it. So as Mark was saying, there was a huge amount of like small tech technologies, low-cost technologies that are coming up that do small things like be able to check how much maize is dried, be able to make sure that there's this amount of pH in the soil. Those things already exist, but then just low-tech versions will allow them to be used in Africa at a lower cost that people can purchase.
I also think that the other kind of commonality that we see in these markets is the centrality of the mobile device, right? Mm-hmm. Because if we go to a farm in Iowa, no doubt the farmer has a smartphone, but the smartphone is not the central computer for that farm, right? They might have, they might have actual, desktop computers, right, or laptops where, a lot of the decision making is taking place. They have essentially legacy systems, whereas the trick in most of these smallholder ecosystems is that, the smartphone is the computer. The smartphone is where these decisions are being taken, and so these kind of mobile first approaches, right, are more relevant in these markets.
Yeah, and it's often not even smartphones, right?
It's feature phones.
Feature phones. Yeah.
Yeah, that can SMS.
You guys have your investment in like WeFarm, right, which is mostly feature phone.
Yeah. So they use these SMS messaging to help them get information about weather or just swap ideas with other farmers. Super smart. So going back to, thinking more about sort of nature technologies, and you mentioned regenerative agriculture, Isaac, and this is a big theme that we're seeing over the last couple of years, the concept of farming, not just, being too extractive, but actually improving the land that you are farming on, and ideally sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. So there's been a lot of excitement that the agriculture industry could be a solution to climate change and emissions. And with that is developing carbon markets. So where you could measure in some way your soils and determine that you have sequestered X amount of carbon, you could then sell that on as a carbon credit, and big emitting industries could buy them. And there's companies in the US like Indigo and SIBO Technologies who are creating some of these carbon markets. Obviously, carbon markets are nothing necessarily new, and they've been around for other industries. But it's a really interesting and it's catching a lot of attention outside of ag tech, which is great. So a question I have is, what do you think that those carbon markets would be relevant for smallholder farming nations, and how could it work?
Yeah, so the difficulty with that starts from the technology, right? You're just talking about how we could look at ways that perhaps farmers would get tools and technologies that are very low cost. So I guess the conversation starts from what kind of technologies exist and how do we make them low cost, or how do we create business models that make them easily applicable in those scenarios. If we're able to do that, then maybe we can have a conversation of how we're going to use perhaps blockchain, for example, and these things exist, right? Blockchain to be able to track the data and make sure that across the chain, different stakeholders know exactly what's happening on the farm, how much carbon is being sequestered, etc., and then partner. But this is an ecosystems approach. We need different organizations to be coming together as stakeholders, for example, the smallholder farming communities, the industries that are interested in kind of leveraging that carbon footprint, and then basically governments and NGOs that are also in the discussion to come together and develop a module. As it stands now, smallholder farmers only cannot do that on themselves because they cannot manufacture the technologies. They may not even have enough money. But they are very important because we are talking about 70% of all farm populations in Ghana being that kind of population. So are they very important? Yes, but we should find a way to bring them in.
Interesting. So it's about the deployment and adoption of technologies first to even enable measuring and monitoring this. Mark, what do you think? I mean, where's the conversation around carbon markets and regenerative agriculture in India?
I think it's still in the early days, but I think what's interesting is over the course of the last few years, a lot of the agri-tech ecosystem activity in India has focused on farmer platforms. So they have focused on this kind of base layer of digitization occurring over our agricultural ecosystem, right? You have to remember that in India, we have 130 million smallholder farmers, right? 130 million farmers in total, the vast majority of whom are smallholders. And so any kind of effort to put in place regen or sustainable ag, you really need to have a very large farmer network that is working with those farmers across a variety of functions, inputs, market linkages, financing, and other areas, before you can kind of introduce something like regenerative agriculture into the mix. And I think what's interesting is as some of these farmer networks really scale, right? You know, we're getting to the point with Dehat, for example, where we've got about 1 million farmers on the platform, where, you know, at that point, you can definitely introduce some of these regenerative practices at scale and see a substantial impact and be able to measure it. And then, you know, these platforms can serve as the conduit for whatever kind of carbon credits or benefits are being created, because they can aggregate this impact and then, you know, connect with the other ecosystem participants to monetize it. So I think that's pretty exciting. We've seen a really an earlier and smaller scale version of this in our portfolio company, Fussell, which is essentially gamifying water credits. So obviously different than regen, but they've seen some great success in gamifying, convincing farmers to use less water. And the hope is that when they do this at scale, we can think about what to do with kind of that reduction, that benefit of reduction in water usage. But I think the real trick is, you know, it's working through these very, very large platforms that are addressing a variety of concerns of these farmers, and then building the regen story or the sustainability story into those platforms.
Yeah, very true.
Do you have any concerns around how this all could roll out? You know, there are even in you know, the US and Europe as well, that the benefits for some of this carbon farming, let's say, could end up going into the hands of the large corporations. So I'm imagining, you know, some people are talking about one of the first steps for converting to regenerative agriculture and then getting paid for that is monitoring, which can be done with satellite technology or with drone technology. And you could imagine there's some large agriculture companies that have that capability to monitor and track. Okay, so this amount of land has been moved into cover cropping. That's great. And they could then, you know, work with the supply chain companies who are taking the offtake from those smallholders. And in the end, the carbon credits go to these large corporations, and they don't get down to the smallholders. You know, do you see that being a concern?
I see that as a definite risk, right? It's a lot easier to do this kind of measuring and monitoring on a 3,000, you know, acre corn and soy operation in Illinois than it is to work across, you know, work across millions of smallholders in India. My hope is that, before we start rewarding farmers, large farmers in the US and Europe for things they might have already been doing already, and especially given that many of these farmers already collect massive subsidies from their governments, that will prioritize, smallholders or give additional weight to these benefits flowing to smallholders. And maybe that's a matter of doing a more comprehensive carbon accounting, right? If a large Iowa or Illinois farm has a huge carbon footprint already, right? Maybe rewarding them for incrementally changing that it should be less of a priority than a more carbon neutral operation in Africa or Southeast Asia that is, trying to become much more beneficial from a carbon perspective.
Yeah, so piggyback on what you said, Mark, I think that the point about collaboratives really help, like systems that already exist to help farmers progress. Because the thing is that regenerative agriculture also becomes a lifestyle farming, right? They have to buy into the idea first of all. And when, for example, you're a startup and you go there, they might not trust you necessarily. You have to work through their farm advisors that already trust for maybe dozens of months or years working with them. But I think that eventually that's how it's supposed to go. Through this collaborative, if the possibility of profit sharing could come from carbon sequestration or anything like that, because these systems exist already, there could be a way to even incentivize technology. So Mark, you may know about mobile money in Africa, maybe pay farmers, maybe monthly, quarterly, something. Through their mobile phone technologies, but that's going to take time. I think that this is just the beginning of the whole process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up fintech. So often when I've been speaking with entrepreneurs in regions like Africa, and they say have a solar powered irrigation pump, selling it to farmers, as you mentioned, they don't have necessarily the money to afford it. So those startups have actually become lenders, or they've been giving these technologies on credit. So essentially becoming fintech platforms, or they're helping, enabling farmers to create their own credit. It's becoming like a one-stop shop essentially. In order to get this technology, they need to provide this bit more and this bit more to kind of support farmers. Do you see a lot more startups in the regions that you're working in take that route? Or do you think that there's a role, dare I say it, for like public policy, for governments to kind of help with that adoption of technology?
I think in general, whenever governments get into subsidizing hardware, it has its own adverse effects, right? And companies wind up producing not necessarily the optimal technology, but whatever is being subsidized, and they spend a huge amount of time chasing those subsidies, which is never easy, no matter where it's being done, whether it's India or Bangladesh or Sub-Saharan Africa or wherever. So I tend to be, in theory, fine with government subsidizing this. In practice, I think tricky for the startups that are trying to operate in this space. I think they're very excited about it at first, and I think they discover, sometimes years later that these subsidies can be problematic. I think in general, it's hard to sell innovative hardware to farmers. It just is. So the extent to which you can bundle it with financing certainly helps. But I would also add that there are other ways to help, with that sale, right? So for example, you can bundle it not just with financing, but with actual market linkage support. That's something that, I've mentioned Fossil a couple times now, because they're doing these innovative on-farm devices for horticulture farmers. And they're getting involved in facilitating the market linkage for these farmers in primarily fruits and some vegetables, because by providing those services, by helping those farmers to make more money, they can get closer to being able to afford these devices. So I think there are other ways. I think financing definitely helps. In some cases that can be a total financing. You can turn that CapEx into OpEx. But I also think there are other ways on the inputs and the output side that you can make the make the hardware part of a larger story. That's certainly what eFishery has done in Indonesia, where they went from pure hardware sales to bundling their hardware in a more complete service offering that addresses these holistic needs of these farmers.
Isaac, how are you financing AgriLab?
So we started financing AgriLab from like small amounts of money from competitions. But as you were saying, actually, there was this government project that we got involved. We were very excited about it. Like, Mark, you should have told us that I told you so. But eventually, exactly what you're saying happened. Just complete inefficiencies throughout the whole thing. And it actually hurts us very badly. So these things exist. The truth is that governments really are all about the politics, right? They are thinking about the next election and how these things can be news headlines for them. But then after the news headlines, the systems that are involved in, they don't necessarily support the entrepreneurs, because the person that probably went in for the tender is somebody linked to the government itself, and they have a cut here and a cut there. So the actual support that comes to the entrepreneurs will be very much reduced. So back to what Mark is saying, I think that obviously the whole perhaps bootstrapping or private VC model is much more beneficial than government, because they come with all these flowery promises, but in the end, it's false flag.
Yeah, I mean, we always see this, right? So like you see a tender get get issued by a government, and you'll see like finally in the winners, right, there might be a few, and it'll be like one startup that you like totally expect, and another startup you totally expect, and some dude you've never heard of, right? And it's
yeah, a company that was started up last month.
Cousin of the minister, right? And then that dude will go approach the other companies to be like, well, I don't have any product, so can I buy yours, right? And it's just like these things are more trouble than they're worth.
Sure.
Okay, a question we've had in is, are you hopeful that governments will begin to tackle perverse subsidies in the ag sector in the next 10 years?
Nope, not at all. I mean, look, I think these subsidies have long histories and really powerful vested interests. I hope that in general we can move these subsidies away from shaping production decisions in favor of ensuring farmer welfare. I think that's the kind of major distinction that needs to be made, right? So in India, for example, this government a few years ago launched a program called the PM Kisan. Kisan is Hindi for farmer. And this is about originally it was about just shy of $100 per year being dropped into the bank accounts of farmers, but completely disassociated with pricing or production, right? It was a pure farmer welfare play, and they've actually increased it during the pandemic. And I would rather see that kind of social benefit that says, oh, you're a cultivator, here, have some money, as opposed to the kinds of systems that we oftentimes have in India where, for example, and this was a lot of what the farmer protests in Delhi were about, where it's all about the preservation of this system that encourages farmers, irrespective of what the market wants, to produce legacy crops like rice and wheat, especially in places where the water table is in free fall. So I would rather with guaranteed pricing and therefore guaranteed profits. So I hope that we can move away from production and pricing based policies to more farmer welfare based policies disassociated from those decisions, so that we can ultimately protect farmers and help farmers without continuously keeping in place this overproduction of foods we don't need.
And what about subsidies for farming practices? so for adopting regenerative agriculture practices for sequestering carbon? Do you think there could be a linkage there?
I think those would be good things, but like Louisa, I think you've participated in some of these discussions with like Sarah Mock in the last few weeks about kind of the U.S. system, and one of the things that really struck me was the conservation agriculture program in the U.S. Only like 4% of farmers participate in it, even though it's been around for like decades, right? So I found that very interesting because I expected that number to be much, much higher. Maybe if we craft more intelligent, more targeted subsidies towards regen and sustainability, then hopefully they'll have more of an impact.
What do you think, Isaac?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that Max has said. Definitely, we don't see governments trying to make sure that. I mean, in my experience with governments, just as I said, they are all about the next election and all of that. I think that exactly what Max said. We should make sure that we are talking about farmer health, welfare. I mean, I don't want to take this conversation away, but it's just like what we're seeing in the US, right? People are being paid an incentive just for being a citizen, and there's a hardship. Farmers go through a lot of those things a lot, especially here. There's a dry season that almost no farmer is able to cultivate. So if there is that kind of incentive for their welfare, it's better. And we should just try and focus on creating enabling business environments for startups, and if we are trying to say support startups or technology companies that are in this field to actually operate and not come with all this government interference, than actually trying to say we're setting up this fund or that fund. Because in fact, in the end, it doesn't actually trickle down to the people who are supposed to get it.
Not at all.
Okay, final question. We've got 2 minutes for each of you. Which technology are you most excited about? Which food systems technology are you most excited about? Or maybe it's one that you wish existed but doesn't yet.
I'm really excited about. I would say that I'm really excited to see the next generation of agri-biotech start getting applied in the developing world. Whether it's CRISPR or gene editing, we've had almost a standstill in progress in agri-biotech going on a decade now in India. I mean, actually 12 years that nothing has been cleared by the regulator in this space because these were legacy transgenics, and I'm very hopeful and excited that we'll start, now that it's not using exogenous genetics in the form of transgenic products, but instead more intelligent, gene editing and other kind of platforms. I'm very hopeful that we'll start seeing a new wave of agri-biotech focused on, some of our target crops that are not necessarily the big target crops everywhere else in the world. Things like banana, things like coffee, things like millets and pulses that are more focused on kind of our food situation. And so and I think that will help tremendously in this kind of nature tech space. So yeah, that would be what I'm hopeful to see.
Yeah, I think the most exciting technology for me now in the world generally is blockchain, because of its ability to just make sure cross-border transaction is possible. I mean, in farming, I think there's a possibility for fair trade to finally occur at some level, especially for timber farmers, for cocoa farmers, for these kind of farmers that exist in the outermost part of the country, but that are crucial in building up the country, but then they did not get actually anything. So, you may know that Ghana is actually one of the leading producers of cocoa in Ghana, in the world. And China was just recently announced to be participating in cocoa cultivation. There was all this hullabaloo again around that conversation. But the truth is that we are always projecting Ghana to be that kind of country that does this, that does that. But farmers who are actually involved do not get to participate. I'm looking at the possibility of blockchain to to help that. We can track what is going on in the farm. We can track how much money is moving from A to B. And then we can know that, okay, this farmer actually deserves this amount of money to enable that fair trade to happen. Apart from that, precision agriculture has existed for a very long time. I'm looking at the way that the next level farms, I guess, smallholder farms will be able to benefit from that. So maybe not advanced technology itself, but maybe actually a way of just getting that technology that already exists to these part of farms and see how they can pay for it. Innovative solutions like in business models that can allow them to participate fully.
Great. Thank you both so much.
Thanks,
this was a great session.
Yeah, thank you
Everyone
very
should
much.
reach out to both of you if they want to find out more about your areas. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks, Louisa.
Bye.